Case of Jamie Melgar. Sandra Melgar often lies in her small prison cell, reflecting on the unexpected turns her life has taken. She never imagined she'd become a widow and a suspect in her husband's murder. A year and a half after his tragic death, a grand jury indicted her. And nearly 5 years later, a jury convicted her based solely on circumstantial evidence. There was no clear motive or physical proof linking her to the crime. Since her husband's passing, every day has been a living nightmare for Sandra, now 59. Sometimes, she still expects to go back home and catches herself wanting to share things with him, only to remember he's gone. In a recent interview, Sandra's blue eyes were red and puffy from crying. She said with tears streaming down her pale cheeks that it didn't feel like he was really gone and that it was like he was just away on a trip. She paused, then continued that she tried not to dwell on it and knew she would see him again. For the past 10 months, Sandra had been imprisoned at the William P. Hobby Unit, a women's prison in the Texas countryside. Sandra maintains contact with her friends and family, many of whom still believe she is innocent. Despite the difficulties of communicating in a noisy prison environment and her soft voice, she regularly talks to her daughter, Elizabeth Liz Melgar Rose. Sandra also writes letters to her friends, who keep her updated about her Pomeranian, Lola, who was at home on the night of the incident. Thanks to the efforts of one of her closest friends, Sandra gets to spend a couple of hours with a rotating group of friends and family every weekend. Her daughter Liz is her biggest supporter, acting as her spokesperson and passionately arguing that her mother's imprisonment is a grave injustice that has deprived her of both parents. Liz mentioned that she had never seen her mother so broken and devastated, and that she had never been able to recover from that. Sandra's husband Jamie met a tragic end on December 23, 2012. Sandra has no memory of that night, which has raised suspicions among investigators. However, she maintains her innocence, insisting she did not commit the crime. As Sandra sits in her prison cell, her thoughts often go back to the evening of their 32nd wedding anniversary, on December 23, 2012. That night, she and Jamie had celebrated together. Later, she was awoken by their barking dogs to find herself bound and gagged on the closet floor, her head throbbing and her body aching. Sandra tried to stretch her legs and peek through the gap under the closet door, but her bindings and 2 hip replacements as fragments limited her movement. Even if she could free herself, a chair blocked the door handle, preventing her escape. In the same closet, she would later discover her husband Jamie lying lifeless with 31 stab wounds to his hands and chest. The white walls were now stained with blood, and a gray telephone cord was used to bind Jamie's feet. A quick note before we continue. As you know, on Uncover Eyes, we release new videos every other day. Many of you have reached out expressing a desire for daily content, so we've launched a new channel, also focused on real-life crime stories, called Secret Crime Mysteries. On the days we don't post videos on Uncover Eyes, we'll be uploading them on Secret Crime Mysteries. This means if you're looking for daily doses of astonishing real-life crime cases, don't hesitate to subscribe. Without further ado, let's dive into today's case. A medical examiner later determined that all of Jamie's injuries were defensive wounds, indicating that he had fought back against his attacker instead of trying to escape. One particularly vicious blow had nearly severed his right thumb, which likely contributed to the extensive blood splatters found in the closet and bedroom. The bedroom was in disarray, with dresser drawers open and clothes, books and pill bottles scattered all over the floor. Sandra's purse and wallet had been rummaged through, and their contents were strewn across the blood-stained white comforter on the bed. A small white medical stool at the foot of the bed had blood stains on it, suggesting that it had been used as a makeshift surface for a knife during the attack. Nearby, a wooden chair had blood dripping down its back. The jacuzzi bathtub where Sandra and Jamie had celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary just the night before told a tragic story. A blood-stained white blouse, a green towel, and a silver chef knife with a 6-inch blade covered in blood droplets in every crevice were found in the bathtub, revealing the chilling details of the events that had unfolded. Police identified a knife as the murder weapon, a stark contrast to the joyful evening that had preceded it. Earlier that night, Sandra and Jamie had celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary with dinner at their favorite Mexican restaurant, planning to continue the celebration in their jacuzzi with candles, cocktails, strawberries, and whipped cream. After more than 3 decades together, Jamie and Sandra remained deeply in love, as Sandra would later tell the authorities. They had met in their senior year at Lamar High School, where Jamie was immediately smitten with the 17-year-old Sandra, who had blue eyes and blonde hair. Sandra was drawn to his sense of humor, intelligence, and kind nature, while Jamie admired her intelligence, down-to-earth personality, and humility. Before long, they became extremely close, and 2 years after graduating from high school, they got married in a simple ceremony at a courthouse in downtown Houston. On their anniversary, Sandra and Jamie relaxed in their jacuzzi, reflecting on their past and future. They dreamed of traveling, visiting the Grand Canyon, Ireland, and seeing the Northern Lights. With Jamie's retirement from the Houston Independent School District approaching, they envisioned a beachfront property to settle down after their adventures. Sandra and her husband Jamie spent a romantic evening together, giving each other massages and relaxing in the jacuzzi. However, their peaceful night was interrupted by their dogs barking. Jamie got out of the bathroom to take care of the dogs, and that was the last time Sandra saw him alive. Meanwhile, Jamie's brother Herman was waiting outside the house, wondering why no one was answering the door. Herman and his family had been invited over for dinner, but Jamie and Sandra weren't responding to calls or the doorbell. Herman found it strange, especially since Jamie's truck was still in the driveway and Sandra's car was parked in the open garage. Herman told his family to wait by the front door while he went to the backyard to take a look. He noticed a plastic tarp hanging from the pergola on the back porch, which was evidence of Jamie's recent DIY project. Herman then went back to the front yard and decided to check the laundry room door inside the garage. If it was locked, he thought they would leave, but to his surprise, the door was unlocked. He entered the house, finding it dimly lit, gray and stuffy, with all the blinds closed. As he opened the front door, the dogs started barking and jumping around, creating an unsettling atmosphere. That was when they heard muffled screams. Herman rushed to the back of the house and found a large chair blocking the closet door in the bathroom. Inside, he found Sandra lying on the floor in a black satin nightgown, screaming for help. Herman and his wife Maria worked to free Sandra from the tight restraints that bound her arms and legs. To help, Herman got a pair of scissors from the bathroom. Meanwhile, Sandra repeatedly asked, "Where's Jamie?" She had visible bruises on her arms, including a dark one on her left bicep. After Herman and Maria finally freed her, Sandra rushed into the bedroom and found Jamie's lifeless body hidden in the closet, his feet sticking out. Despite it being clear that he was dead, given his cold, pale, and naked body, she still checked for a pulse. Sandra put a blue jacket on her injured husband Jamie, and with Maria's help got him back to the bathroom. When the paramedics arrived, Sandra was extremely distraught, making it hard for her to talk to the first paramedic, Stephanie Roberts. According to Roberts' report, Sandra was in shock, crying periodically and had lost track of time. Her last clear memory was around 1 a.m., and she was unaware that 15 hours had passed. The police noticed bruises on Sandra's hands and arms, as well as a small scratch on her left thumb, but no visible blood. Sandra told the police that after Jamie let the dogs in, she got out of the bathtub and went to her closet to get dressed. Then she claimed to have no memory until she woke up in the closet at an unknown time, eventually screaming for help, but possibly falling back asleep due to a seizure. Sandra had several serious medical conditions, including lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and grand mal seizures, which had forced her to resign from her job as a licensed vocational nurse. In the weeks leading up to Jamie's murder, Sandra experienced warning signs of an impending seizure, known as auras. After a seizure, she would sleep for hours, then wake up feeling disoriented, confused, and in pain. During the investigation, Sandra was questioned by Sheriff Sergeants Shacazel and James Duay at the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Sandra felt uncomfortable in the cold interrogation room and asked to take a polygraph test, despite feeling cold and shaky. The 3-hour interrogation focused on the 36 hours leading up to Jamie's death. Sandra spoke softly and complained of having a headache. She recalled specific details about her activities, such as removing her boots in the bedroom and their conversation in the jacuzzi. However, she struggled to remember other details, and her memory was unclear. Sandra initially said Jamie had left her alone for 15 minutes to let the dogs in before she got out of the jacuzzi. Later, she thought it might have been around 5 minutes. She admitted to being bad at keeping track of time and was just making guesses about the timeline. When asked about their future plans, Sandra became overwhelmed and burst into tears. Cazal suggested that Sandra might have been involved in Jamie's death, which prompted Sandra to ask for a lawyer, saying she wasn't going to answer any more questions because she felt confused. Douay asked Sandra if she would take a polygraph test, but she refused, citing concerns about her nervousness, physical symptoms, and the potential for the results to be used against her. She wanted to consult with a lawyer first. Douay seemed frustrated by her refusal, implying that it suggested she had something to hide. He warned Sandra that the investigation would be thorough and that they would gather information about her, her husband, and their relationships with neighbors and family members. Sandra hoped the investigation would focus on someone else, insisting she wasn't involved in Jamie's murder. When asked about her relationship with her husband, she described it as great, even better lately. As the interrogation neared its end, the detectives grew frustrated with Sandra's claims of having no memory of the events. They pressed her, wondering how she could have been unaware of her husband being brutally stabbed in the bedroom just a few feet away, and why she hadn't heard his screams. Detective Cazal implored her to help, but Sandra repeatedly denied having heard anything, covering her face with her hands. Cazal and Douay left the cold, confined room, leaving Sandra crying with her face in her hands. Later, Cazal contacted the Harris County District Attorney's Office to file murder charges against Sandra. However, the DA's office ultimately decided not to pursue those charges due to a lack of evidence. 2 days after the murder, Liz met with Cazal and Douay, telling them that various items were missing from the house, including a TV and medication. She also shared information about her mother's health issues and seizures. Unfortunately, this meeting didn't lead to any significant breakthroughs in the case. Liz continued to call the authorities, asking about the progress of the investigation, but eventually they stopped responding to her calls. A year and a half later, Sandra was quietly indicted for Jamie's murder by a grand jury. However, the grand jury proceedings were kept secret, leaving the public unaware of the discussions and evidence presented. Sandra's case moved slowly, passing from one prosecutor to another over the next 3 years. Finally, it landed on Colleen Barnett's desk in May 2017. Barnett was a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for being diligent and fair. Despite the challenges in the case, including no apparent motive, no confession, and no direct evidence linking Sandra to the crime, Barnett believed in the case. During the 13-day trial, Barnett portrayed Sandra as a calculating murderer who had planned Jamie's death. She claimed that Sandra had tied Jamie's feet with a gray telephone cord and then stabbed him with a knife. Barnett also highlighted the presence of a bag of sex toys found on the bed, which Sandra later claimed was a gag gift from a friend. Although Barnett couldn't pinpoint a motive for Sandra's actions, she presented various theories, including Jamie's life insurance policy and Sandra's supposed desire to end their marriage. Sandra's attorney, George Sechrist, presented a different perspective on the case, arguing that Sandra was a victim of investigators who had prematurely settled on a theory. He claimed that the lack of physical evidence connecting Sandra to the crime, including the absence of her blood at the scene and cuts on her hands, suggested that she was not involved. Instead, Sechrist proposed that Sandra had fallen prey to a home invasion, suffered a head injury, and was bound in her closet while intruders killed her husband. Prosecutor Barnett countered with expert testimony from Celestina Rossi, a blood spatter analyst and crime scene reconstructionist. Rossi testified that the crime scene did not match a home invasion scenario, citing the lack of forced entry, undisturbed dresser drawers, and a lit candle on Jamie's nightstand, indicating no struggle near the closet where Jamie was killed. The majority of the blood was confined to the closet with spatter on a chair, medical stool, and comforter, which Rossi attributed to the injury to Jamie's artery. Rossi concurred with the medical examiner's report that Jamie's wounds were defensive and noted his loaded handgun near his body in the closet, untouched. This evidence, Rossi suggested, pointed to Sandra's guilt. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over several days before finding Sandra guilty of murder, sentencing her to 27 years in prison. The jury foreman later explained that they did not believe Sandra was a threat to society and wanted to give her a chance to see her grandchildren. When the verdict was read, Sandra let out a shriek and nearly collapsed into her seat. The courtroom, filled with supporters who believed in her innocence, was left in stunned disbelief. As Sandra was escorted out of the courtroom, she paused to embrace her daughter, Liz, one last time. Liz was devastated, feeling that the justice system had failed her family, taking away both her parents. Sandra's supporters were outraged at Barnett, accusing her of manipulating Sandra's words, exploiting her religious beliefs, and fabricating a false narrative that led to her imprisonment. In contrast, the jury foreman stood by the verdict, believing Barnett's version of events was the most plausible. He found Sandra's story inconsistent, citing her changing account of their return home and the time Jamie spent in the jacuzzi before she retreated to her closet. He also questioned the authenticity of her seizure that night, referencing her medical records, which indicated stable seizures, and her visit to the neurologist after the murder, during which she made no mention of the alleged seizure. The foreman stated that the more he listened to Sandra's statements, the more he realized they didn't make sense. He believed the evidence pointed to her guilt, but acknowledged that the jury could be wrong. A month after the verdict, Sandra's lawyer, Sechrist, filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that the investigation was inept, and the prosecution's case was built on conjecture and hypotheses with no solid evidence. Sechrist contended that Sandra was innocent, but Judge Johnson denied the motion, setting in motion a potentially lengthy appeals process. Sandra, seated behind a glass partition, maintained her innocence, softly asserting that she did not kill her husband. When asked who might have committed the crime, she replied, "I wish I knew." She clings to hope for a future release, whether through a successful appeal or parole, which she will be eligible for in 2031, when she will be 71 years old. In the early hours of January 3, 1991, when the Seaside police arrived at Sabato Park, they discovered the body of Vicki Johnson, a 34-year-old mother of 3 lying on the sand on the playground. The police couldn't believe the sight before them. Vicki had suffered a very horrible death right in the park. She had been strangled and suffocated. Her upper torso, which held part of her clothing, was set on fire, and she had a significant amount of sand lodged down her throat, as if her head had been held in the sand. Vicki also had bite marks from the attacker all over her body, and her clothes were torn. Her murder was so brutal that it left the community of Seaside in shock for many years. Due to the crack epidemic and the high crime rate at the time, Seaside was known as a violent community. That reputation was only strengthened by Vicki Johnson's brutal murder. Her case remained cold for almost 4 decades after investigators exhausted all possible leads. In 2021, Vicki's case was reopened by the Monterey County District Attorney's Office when the Cold Case Task Force was launched. After providing additional evidence to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing, investigators were able to identify a suspect in connection with the murder after 2 years of thorough testing. Thanks to the DNA sample taken from Vicki's fingernails, authorities were able to identify her killer as Frank Lewis McClure after entering the DNA into Cody's. Apparently, McClure left significant DNA underneath Vicki's fingernails while she struggled and fought vigorously for her life. Frank Lewis McClure, who had lived all his life in Seaside, had a long list of crimes in his history book. His criminal history dates back to 1990 and includes assault, causing serious bodily harm, and resisting law enforcement. McClure broke the terms of his probation in 1994 by engaging in domestic violence and an assault with a deadly weapon. He received a 4-year prison term afterwards. From 1991 to 2011, Frank Lewis McClure committed numerous crimes involving domestic violence and assault. He received little time in prison and was, however, never charged for murder. It is unknown whether McClure and Vicki were romantically involved. The motive of her murder is still unknown and probably will remain a mystery since Frank Lewis McClure died at the age of 77 in 2021 in his seaside home. Regardless, Vicki Johnson's family is grateful that the murder has been solved. On September 28, 1979, 3 visitors who were out day tripping in Sugar Pine Point State Park called a local news reporter to report finding a body at a picnic area on Lake Tahoe's western coast in California. When the cops showed up, they discovered a terrifying situation. There laid a woman who had been battered and strangled to death. A lost shoe and numerous indications of prior battles suggested the woman had been pursued across the campground before her assailant caught up with her. Detectives assumed that she was most likely a solo traveler because there was no indication of her car or of any other possessions that would have served as identification. Despite the collection of forensic evidence, including a sexual assault kit from the crime scene, the case gradually became cold since neither the murder victim nor her possible killer could be identified. The young woman was reluctantly buried by the authorities in a simple grave with the sign unidentified female. Many years later, in 2015, the El Dorado County Cold Case Homicide Unit made the decision to re-examine the long-dead Jane Doe and provided local Jewish newspapers with images of a particular religious jewelry she had been wearing when she was discovered. This appeared to have been a great move because the daughter of the victim reached out to the police after she recognized the jewelry. A DNA test was conducted and the victim was identified as Patricia Carnahan through a DNA match to her now 61-years-old daughter. Patricia Carnahan was 35 years old when she vanished while traveling throughout California in a red Volkswagen minibus in September 1979. Earlier that month, she had let her family know she was returning home, but after a month of not returning, Patricia's family in Virginia had reported her missing. Even though her Volkswagen was later found abandoned at a car dealership in Venice, California at the time, there were still no leads as to Patricia Carnahan's whereabouts. After her identity has been verified, authorities returned Patricia Carnahan's body to her family for a proper burial. Investigators were now left with catching Patricia's killer. After investigators tested the DNA on a discarded beer bottle that was discovered near where Patricia Carnahan was found, it matched the male DNA found on her body during autopsy. The 3 men who reported finding a body in 1979 were then tested for a DNA match, but they were immediately excluded as their DNA didn't match the one at the crime scene. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile of the suspect into Cody's, but there was no match at the time. In 2022, in order to deal with the state's backlog of testing rape kits, the Washington State Attorney General's office launched the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Project. Since 1981, the Spokane Police Department has maintained over 1,500 untested kits on hand, some of which were used in a rape investigation involving a man named Harold Carpenter. 1994. A homeless Spokane lady alleged that Harold Carpenter had physically and sexually abused her in April 1994. At the time, Carpenter was arrested and placed into the Spokane County Jail on a charge of second-degree rape. The case was, however, suspended after it was determined to be unprovable, and no official charges were ever filed. The rape kit was nevertheless saved as evidence. After the rape victim's kit was turned in for DNA testing in August 2022, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab notified Spokane Police Department detectives in early February 2023 that the DNA from the 1994 rape kit is connected not only to the DNA in Cody's, but also to the 1979 murder of Patricia Carnahan in El Dorado County, which was a cold case at the time. Based on this evidence, in 2023, investigators from El Dorado County arrived in Spokane to help the Spokane Police Department arrest Harold Carpenter. After his arrest, investigators soon learned that Carpenter had been involved in a handful of misdemeanors over the years, ranging from burglary, sexual assaults, disturbing the peace, possession of drugs, reckless driving, driving under the influence, among many others. However, he was never suspected of killing Patricia Carnahan. He either got away with his crimes or served a minimum time behind bars. Carpenter made his first court appearance in Spokane in March 2023. He remains jailed in lieu of $1 million bail. In June 1980, Holly and Campelia, a native of New Jersey, vanished following a period of poor mental health. Holly had been battling with mental issues since high school but she became increasingly erratic when she got to college. One fateful day on her way to a counseling appointment, she jumped out of her mother's car and was never seen again. All her family knew at the time was that she hitchhiked to Sacramento. After sending her family one letter, Holly stopped contacting them. Immediately after her disappearance, her parents, Augustine and Sally Campiglia, reported her missing. But unknowingly to them, her name was accidentally removed from the National Missing Persons Database. Meanwhile, in August 1980, the body of a 21-year-old woman was discovered in a cornfield off Seavers Road in Dixon, not far from the location of the current Pedrick Produce Market. She was dressed in a green wool sweater despite the summer heat and had been shot in the head numerous times. Detectives at the time had no idea that the woman's name had unintentionally been erased from the National Missing People database just 2 weeks prior. The victim and her murderer could not be identified, and so she was dubbed Dixon Jane Doe for 12 years. In 1992, when Augustine and Sally Campiglia got to know that their daughter Holly and Campiglia had accidentally dropped from the missing persons database used by law enforcement, they contacted the officials to re-add her name into the database. 5 weeks later, the Campiglias were informed by Solano County detectives that they had a match. Holly Ann was their Dixon Jane Doe. This was heartbreaking news for Holly's family. In an interview, her mother Sally sadly said, "I just kept hoping she would show up one day with grandchildren. But with each year, I'd lose a little hope." Even though Holly Ann could now be laid to rest properly, neither her family nor the police knew what had happened to her. The investigation was abandoned until 2021, when Holly Ann's relatives contacted the police to inquire about the possibility of using modern forensic methods to identify Holly Ann's killer. Investigators got to work, and a male's DNA was found after evidence samples of the crime scene were sent for testing. In 2023, investigators from the Solano County Sheriff's Office declared that they think the DNA belongs to Herman Lee Hobbs, who is currently 76 years old and serving a sentence at a prison in Chowchilla. According to research, Herman Lee Hobbs had been a violent criminal throughout his adult life. In 1969, when he was 22 years old, he was accused of carrying out more than a dozen armed robberies across the Sacramento region. Hobbs admitted to being the serial robber and consented to plead guilty after leading police on a wild car chase. However, when it was time for his sentence, the 6'5" mechanic attempted to flee the courthouse and had to be tackled and subdued by a CHP officer. Herman Lee Hobbs' time behind bars for armed robbery was brief. He was back on the streets by 1975. He relocated to Rio Linda, a street away from Terry Pata, a 13-year-old junior high school student. One day in January 1975, Terry Pata was sent home from school early due to her having nausea and a headache. She, however, never made it home. 9 days later, her body was discovered nearby, placed inside a drain pipe. She had been raped and fatally stabbed. At the time, no suspect was ever found. Years of sexual assault by Herman Lee Hobbs weren't made public until 2000. He was convicted of raping a 15-year-old girl in Yuba County that year. When Hobbs was taken into prison, his niece and daughter came forward to express concerns that he might be responsible for the deaths of numerous children. This tip led investigators to Terry Pata's long-suppressed murder. When DNA from Terry Pata's crime scene was examined, it matched Hobbs. Hobbs, who was already serving a lengthy jail sentence for rape, pled not guilty to Terry Pata's murder and was given a further 25 years to life sentence. This was just the start. That same year, some loggers discovered a woman's skull in the Yuba County foothills. Through DNA testing, the remains were identified as 29-year-old Brenda and Tucker, who vanished from her house in the area of Oroville in 1994. Hobbs was known to Brenda Tucker's loved ones. In the 1990s, he had occasionally even stayed at their home. Hobbs was accused of killing Tucker, but a court eventually dropped the charges in 2002 owing to a lack of proof. In 2023, after his DNA was a match to the DNA at Holly and Campiglia's crime scene, Solano County investigators had Hobbs moved to the Justice Center Detention Facility in Fairfield. He is being charged with first-degree murder. According to the Solano County Sheriff's Office, investigators are collaborating with other organizations in Northern California to find any additional potential victims of Herman Lee Hobbs. Case of Cody Johnson. At the age of 23, Cody was looking for a long-term partner. He confided in his friends about his desire to marry a woman who shared his values, specifically someone from a religious background. On Halloween 2011, he met Jordan, who would eventually become a pivotal figure in his life. Born in August 1991, Jordan grew up in Kalispell in a deeply religious family. She attended the Faith Baptist Church, where she worked with children and families, and her ultimate goal was to become a stay-at-home mother. When Cody and Jordan first met on Halloween, they quickly formed a connection. Although initially shy, Jordan opened up to Cody about her dreams of starting a family and her love for nature. Cody was smitten, but Jordan, who was only 20 at the time, was not ready for a serious relationship. They went on a few casual dates, but maintained a platonic relationship. However, Cody's feelings for Jordan only intensified, and he made a concerted effort to win her over. He joined her church, First Baptist, and began to socialize with her friends and community. Before long, their friendship blossomed into something more. Cody and Jordan officially started dating in November 2011, and Cody became completely enamored with her, wanting to spend all his time with her. Cody was convinced he wanted to marry Jordan just weeks into their relationship, despite her desire to remain chaste until marriage. Those close to they noticed Jordan didn't seem as invested in Cody as he was in her. While some attributed this to her shy nature, others were concerned about the imbalance in their relationship. They rarely showed affection in public, didn't hold hands, and didn't flirt. So when Cody proposed in December 2012, many of Jordan's friends were surprised she accepted. They thought she wasn't ready for marriage after just a year of dating, but they were happy for her. Jordan eagerly shared her engagement ring on Instagram, captioning the post, "He proposed. Best early Christmas present ever." The wedding was set for June 29, 2013, and planning began immediately. Cody was heavily involved, along with Jordan's best friend and matron of honor, Kimberly Martinez. However, it was Jordan who seemed most enthusiastic about the wedding planning, even going so far as to perform a song with custom-written lyrics by Elizabeth Shee, which would later seem eerily prophetic. When someone, including Kimberly, brought up the idea of actually being married to Cody, Jordan's mood would quickly deteriorate. She repeatedly questioned Kimberly, her matron of honor, about whether she was making the right decision. On her wedding day, Jordan's true feelings about the marriage were evident. She was anxious and avoided eye contact with Cody, frequently looking down. Despite regaining her composure for the wedding photos and first dance, Jordan's unease persisted. The morning after the wedding, Jordan confided in a friend via text from their honeymoon hotel room. She revealed that she had not consummated the marriage and had rejected Cody's advances, not only on their wedding night, but for the next 6 nights as well. Jordan was anxious about Cody's expectations and didn't want to be intimate. She planned to use the excuse that her period had started, hoping it would work, as she feared being forced into something would cause her to panic. Jordan had an intense fear of sex due to her faith and reservations about Cody, causing her to feel anxious about intimacy with him. This anxiety reached a boiling point on July 7th, 8 days after their wedding, when Cody canceled his golfing trip with friends at the last minute because Jordan had planned a surprise for him. After attending church and spending some time alone on the lake, they had dinner with friends at Dairy Queen. Cody then went home with Jordan, and this was the last time anyone saw him. When Cody failed to show up for work, his coworker Cameron Fredrickson became concerned. As a reliable and punctual employee, Cody's absence was unusual. Cameron decided to visit Cody's new house, which he had purchased with Jordan before their wedding. After knocking with no response, Cameron let himself in and searched the house for any clues about their disappearance. However, he found nothing. Cameron's concern turned to fear when he discovered Cody's phone in the garage. It was unusual for Cody to be without his phone, and this sparked grave concerns. After making several calls, Cameron learned that no one had seen Cody since dinner at Dairy Queen at 8:30. He immediately went to the police station to file a missing persons report, and the authorities took the case seriously from the start. Officer Chaz Zimmerman, one of the first to question Cameron, was struck by his distress. Zimmerman found it odd that Cameron's boss, not his wife Kimberly, reported him missing. Later that day, Kimberly finally reached Jordan, who claimed that Cameron had left with friends in a black car with Washington plates. According to Jordan, Cameron had received a disturbing phone call at the restaurant, so she gave him space. However, that night, Kimberly retrieved her phone charger from their car and discovered a text from Cody. The message stated that Cameron had planned to go for a ride with out-of-town friends who were visiting. Cody was unclear about the friends' identities, but Cameron always took his visiting friends to Glacier Park. Jordan told the police that she didn't recognize the men who were involved in Cody's disappearance, and that they hadn't fought that night. She suggested that Cody might have gone joyriding with his friends from out of town as a possible reason for his disappearance. When questioned about why she didn't report Cody missing, Jordan explained that she didn't want to upset him by filing a report if he was planning to return within a few hours. However, as the hours turned into days, Cody's friends and family gathered at the family home, expressing confusion over his sudden disappearance. It didn't seem like something Cody would do, leaving his wife without a word. Jordan maintained her story until Kimberly confronted her about it. As the conversation continued, Jordan became increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually, she became so agitated that she threw her wedding ring across the room. While some thought this was just her unusual way of coping with the situation, Kimberly was convinced that Jordan was hiding something. The next day, she returned home and called her friend. Meanwhile, Jordan was summoned to the police station where she was confronted by officers about the inconsistencies in her story. One of the officers said, "Jordan, I've gathered information that contradicts what you're telling me. I've spoken to several people and it's crucial that I know you're being honest." Jordan responded, "I understand and I think there's more to the story." Around the same time, Sher Johnson met with the police, armed with Cody's phone records from the day he vanished. She was worried about her son and hoped that the mysterious man Cody had called could provide some clues about his disappearance. However, it turned out that the mysterious caller was simply a friend returning a tool to Cody. The police quickly ruled him out as a suspect because he had a solid alibi. His wife was in labor at the time of Cody's disappearance. With all other leads exhausted, police refocused their attention on Jordan. It was clear that she was hiding something, but her story didn't quite add up. On July 10th, a crucial breakthrough emerged in the case. An unexpected email arrived from Carmen Tony 607, claiming that Cody was dead and there was no need to continue searching. The message read, "Hello Jordan, my name is Tony. There is no bother looking for Cody anymore. He is gone." Jordan showed the email to Hannah, remaining expressionless as he relayed the news. According to the email, Cody had supposedly died after falling off a cliff in Glacier National Park while with unknown companions. Hannah was devastated upon reading the message and urged Jordan to report it to the police immediately. Hannah recalled her reaction. "Jordan didn't show any emotion, didn't even cry. She just handed me the email and I started shaking. I told her to go to the police and she did, but I was rushing her saying, 'Go, move. What are you doing?'" Detective Corey Clark was frustrated that the investigation was ongoing and an anonymous email hadn't provided the closure they needed. In fact, the email seemed suspiciously convenient at providing the exact information they'd been searching for, and advising them to call off the search. What bothered Clark more than the email's content was Jordan's reaction, or lack thereof. She seemed completely unfazed by the news, which implied her husband's death. Jordan's behavior became even more peculiar when she organized a trip to Glacier National Park with her friends and family to search for Cody. According to Hannah, Jordan was strangely chipper during the entire drive to the park, waving her hand out the window as they went. Despite finding nothing on the first day, they resumed their search on the second day, and it was then that Jordan suddenly claimed to have found Cody's body. Her announcement was met with skepticism. "I think he's down there," she said, leaving Clark wondering why on earth Cody would be in that location. "It's baffling that someone would do such a thing. This wall serves a purpose, after all." The autopsy revealed that the victim's head and arms suffered the most damage from the fall. Cody's loved ones were heartbroken over his death, but Jordan felt a sense of relief, according to Hannah. Now that a body had been found, the authorities would finally close the case. However, there was still a major issue. The police had no idea who man Tony 607 was. When Jordan was first questioned about the mysterious message, she directed the police to Tony Stockup, a fellow car enthusiast and acquaintance of Cody's. Although Tony hadn't seen Cody in several months, he was so worried about him that he gave the police full access to his accounts. The police were unable to find the email address they were looking for, and Jordan and Cody's phone records did not provide much information. As a result, they had to contact Google to obtain the IP address associated with Carmen Tony 607. While waiting for this information, the police re-interviewed Cody's family and friends. During these interviews, Kimberly finally shared with the police Jordan's fragile mental state leading up to her marriage to Cody. She had expressed doubts and fears about marrying him, asking Kimberly multiple times if she should go through with the wedding. Jordan confided in Kimberly about her horror and fear of having sex with Cody, even regretting that Ed had married him and wishing she could undo everything. When Kimberly advised Jordan to be honest with Cody about her feelings, Jordan responded, "I should be happy, but I'm not. If I tell him, it's going to break his heart." 2 days before Cody's disappearance, Jordan typed a disturbing message. "He held me down the other night and he was in my face." On July 7th, the police discovered another revealing exchange, in which Jordan intended to talk to Cody, but was terrified of his reaction. Jordan went to her friend Kim's house later that day and recounted her conversation with Cody, which didn't go well. Cody became enraged and she left to give him space, eventually spending the night at her step-parents' house. When the police learned about this, they became more suspicious of Jordan. Around the same time, they received information from Google, linked the email address Carmen Tony 67 to her stepfather's computer. Although a brief interview with each member of the Graham family suggested Jordan was behind the email, it wasn't conclusive evidence. However, cell phone records and security cameras painted a clearer picture. The records showed that Cody and Jordan's phones were in the vicinity of Glacier National Park on the night of Cody's disappearance. Security cameras even captured them entering the park at 9:17 p.m. Despite Jordan's initial denial of being with Cody that night, the evidence suggested otherwise. On July 18, 2013, the police brought Jordan in for questioning and presented her with the evidence. She broke down in tears and finally revealed her version of events from July 8th. According to Jordan, she confessed her marital doubts to Cody, leading to a massive argument. Jordan and her friend decided to take a trip to Glacier National Park and went to the Loop Trail. Jordan explained what happened next in her own words. If her friend hadn't intervened, Cody would have fallen face first down the hill. The detectives asked her, why did she turn around and push him? Jordan believed it was because her emotions were overwhelming at the time. She felt immense pressure, anger, and every other emotion, all at once. The detectives were interested in her comment about a blindfold, as they suspected a connection to a stray scarf found near the crime scene. However, Jordan didn't provide any further information, and it was eventually proven to be unrelated. Jordan claimed that Cody's death was an accident, and that she didn't plan the assault in any way. Jordan explained that she hadn't planned to kill her husband Cody. The situation escalated, and in the heat of the moment, she pushed him off the bridge. When asked about the incident, Jordan admitted that Cody had turned his back to her, facing the cliff, and she pushed him with both hands. She also confessed to creating a fake identity, Carmen Tony, and sending messages from her stepfather's house. Despite her confession, the police didn't charge Jordan that day, and she walked out of the station a free woman. However, they later arrested her at Cody's funeral on July 22nd, after she was seen texting on her phone, displaying a lack of respect that eroded any remaining sympathy for her. Rumors circulated that Jordan had killed Cody to escape their marriage without the embarrassment of divorce. Her behavior at the funeral, including texting, seemed to confirm these suspicions, implying that she was more concerned about herself than mourning Cody's death. Jordan's motives were called into question as people wondered if she ever truly loved Cody. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and making false statements. After reviewing the evidence, the jury added premeditated first-degree murder to the list of charges. Her trial began on December 9, 2013. From the start, the prosecution aggressively challenged Jordan's story, raising doubts and inconsistencies. They questioned why she lied to Cody's friends and family and whether she was truly remorseful or innocent. The prosecution's questioning was relentless, and Jordan's situation looked increasingly dire. The testimonies from Cody's loved ones further damaged Jordan's case, portraying her as a heartless wife who murdered her husband to avoid intimacy. Her defense team attempted to argue self-defense, but it seemed unlikely to succeed. Faced with the possibility of a worse outcome, Jordan opted for a plea deal, accepting a 30-year prison sentence without parole in exchange for the prosecution dropping the first-degree murder charge. Before Jordan was sentenced, she tried to withdraw her guilty plea when she learned the prosecution intended to pursue a charge of premeditated first-degree murder, which carried a maximum 50-year sentence. The decision was up to District Judge Donald Malloy, who had to decide whether to accept her original plea or start a new trial. On December 13, 2013, Judge Malloy sentenced Jordan Lynn Graham to 30 years and 5 months in prison. Despite Jordan's attempt to reverse her plea, her case was not reopened or re-examined. The federal prosecution aimed to set a precedent with her case, sending a message that anyone who commits murder under federal jurisdiction will face swift and severe punishment. As a result, Jordan will not be released from prison until she is over 52 years old. On February 27, 2011, a murder occurred in the village of Hyannis, which is found on Cape Cod, Massachusetts' southern coast. Todd Lampley, who was 31 years old, was fatally shot through his bedroom window. It took 12 years to uncover the truth behind Todd's murder, despite some shocking evidence that was discovered at the crime scene. Hyannis is a charming city that is tucked away on Cape Cod, Massachusetts' southern coast. This charming gem is full of history, natural beauty, and endless things to do. The serene waters of the Nantucket Sound surround the village, offering breathtaking sunset views and numerous opportunities for water sport enthusiasts. Hyannis' charming Main Street is lined with vibrant shops, art galleries, and eateries serving delectable regional seafood. For those who love history, the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, loved to spend his summers in Hyannis, and his life is chronicled in the John F. Kennedy Hyannis Museum. In addition to its cultural attractions, Hyannis is home to immaculate beaches that provide a tranquil retreat from the stress of daily life. On February 27, 2011, Hyannis, Massachusetts was calm and peaceful, with a light breeze sweeping through the streets. However, nobody realized that the tranquility of the area was about to be shattered by a heinous crime. Todd Lampley, a young father and adored member of the neighborhood, was about to pass away suddenly. As the evening wrapped up that fateful day, a worried neighbor went to see how Todd was doing. He became aware of an issue as he got closer to Todd's house. He noticed that Todd's door had been locked from the inside. The neighbor became suspicious and immediately contacted the police. The detectives showed up at the address Todd's neighbor had given them. Their anticipation and fear sent their hearts racing. Nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. They could only imagine the worst-case scenario. When they arrived, they discovered a horrific scene. Todd Lampley, a 31-year-old man, had been shot dead through his window and was found lifeless on the floor of his bedroom. The crime scene was covered in blood. It was a horrifying scene. Hyannis residents as a whole were in disbelief. How could such a thing occur in their tranquil neighborhood? The investigation that followed Todd's murder uncovered secrets, lies, and shocking revelations that left everyone in disbelief. The investigators' shock turned to curiosity as they examined the crime scene. When they started to assemble the evidence, 3 shell casings and a black cell phone were discovered at the crime scene. It was clear that Todd had been ruthlessly shot from outside his window. The investigators were left perplexed and with a never-ending stream of inquiries. In an effort to find any clues that might help them identify the murderer, they thoroughly searched the area surrounding Todd's home. No lead went unexplored and no stone went unturned. The detectives were aware that maximum attention to details is needed when it comes to cracking the case. To find anyone who may have heard or seen anything unusual on the night of the murder, detectives went from door to door and interviewed every local resident. As people told their stories, They paid close attention in order to piece together a timeline of events that would aid them in solving the case. However, when the detectives stumbled upon an odd object at the crime scene, Todd Lampley's murder case took an odd turn. Investigators discovered a sweet potato which appeared to have been used to muffle the gunshots. This sweet potato acted as a silencer. It appeared as though the murderer had been influenced by the popular HBO series, The Wire. Season 1 of The Wire features a tragic scene in which a woman is mercilessly shot and killed in her own home by a shooter who is hiding outside her window in the night. Before firing a fatal shot, the killer taps on the glass to draw her in. This terrifying scene is eerily similar to Todd Lampley's real-life murder in Hyannis, Massachusetts, where he was also shot through his bedroom window. However, this is not the only way in which the HBO series affected the murder. According to reports, in Season 4 of the same show, one of the fictitious police detectives solves a murder in which the perpetrator shot his victim to death using a potato as a makeshift silencer. The similarities between Todd Lampley's tragedy and the Wire world are unsettling and menacing, a demonstration of how honestly the show depicts life on the streets, where a similar trick was employed to conceal a gunshot. To muffle the sound of the shots that killed Todd Lampley, the perpetrator used a potato with a hole cut out in the center and placed it over a gun's barrel. Also, the cell phone that was discovered at the shooting scene was registered under the name of one of the show's characters, Marlo Stanfield, which heightens the intrigue of the case. To put it mildly, the relationship between the show and the crime scene was confusing. DNA evidence was found on the sweet potato after investigators sent it for testing. Even then, it would take years for investigators to connect this DNA to a specific individual. Investigators soon had another trail to follow. It was discovered that a handgun believed to have been used in the murder had been dumped into a nearby lake. Later, it was recovered by police after being fished out by citizens. Fortunately, detectives now had another lead in their inquiry. As part of his probation in a separate case, Devaris Hampton, a man with a troubled past and a lengthy criminal record, was wearing a GPS monitoring bracelet at the time of the murder. Hampton was precisely where the gun was thrown into the lake according to location data from his GPS monitoring bracelet. Phone records showed that Hampton and a man who was at Todd Lampley's house at the time of the murder had exchanged phone calls and text messages many times. However, strongest connection is yet to be uncovered. Detectives found evidence of a prior relationship between the victim, Todd Lampley, and the suspect, Devaris Hampton. Hampton once claimed in court that Todd Lampley was responsible for the same area murder of Jacques Sellers in July 2007. It's interesting to note that Jacques was also fatally shot through the window. It appears as though Hampton was leaving a trail of clues for detectives to follow. It was only a matter of time before justice was done, because all the evidence pointed to him. Hampton had created a web of lies and deceit around himself, but it was beginning to fall apart. In 2011, after being detained in an unrelated case just a few days after Todd Lampley's murder, Hampton remained silent and declined to answer any questions regarding the Todd Lampley case when questioned. Although it was a frustrating obstacle, the investigators persisted. They were committed to solving the mystery no matter what. Years of diligent work were finally rewarded in 2016, when DNA evidence linked Hampton to the murder. Hampton had spit some of his phlegm into a puddle, and authorities collected some of it and used it to obtain a DNA swap without Hampton's knowledge. The results were conclusive when they were returned. The sweet potato's DNA matched Hampton's spit's DNA. It was a turning point in the investigation. The pieces were starting to fit together, but even with this damning evidence, it took until February 24, 2023 to capture Devaris Hampton. For the fatal shooting of 31-year-old Todd Lampley, 40-year-old Devaris Hampton was apprehended and charged with 1 count each of murder and assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. When asked why Hampton's arrest was delayed for an extra 7 years, authorities chose not to address the reason for the delay in the tense and uncertain courtroom. In Barnstable District Court, Hampton made his initial court appearance on February 27, 2023, exactly 12 years after the fatal shooting. He pleaded not guilty to the charges against him, firmly declaring his innocence with a serious expression on his face. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Devaris Hampton maintained his composure and resolve, knowing that he faced a protracted and difficult legal battle. As the judge scheduled his next court appearance for April 5, 2023, the courtroom fell silent. The investigation into Todd Lampley's murder may have reached a conclusion and a suspect has been named, but it's far from over. Russell Enos, an assistant district attorney, has been coy about the delay in the case, saying only that the evidence has been evaluated. Edward Fogarty, Hampton's court-appointed attorney, has pledged to mount a resolute defense and expressed faith in his client's innocence. The case of Heidi Ferks. Heidi Marie Erickson was born on December 14, 1984 to John and Alinda Erickson and was the youngest of their 3 children and their only daughter. She was known for her playful and artistic nature and lived her life to the fullest. After graduating from high school in 2003, she continued her education at the University of Northwestern in Roseville. During this time, she was a regular attendee at Calvary Church in the city, where she had been involved since her early years. It was at Calvary Church that she met Nicholas "Nick" Ferkus, with whom she shared the role of youth group leaders, serving their community with dedication and passion. Nicholas Ferkus was born on February 25, 1983, to Julie and Steve Ferkus. He was a driven and ambitious young man who dedicated himself to his work. As the director of operations at a reputable carpet cleaning company. Known for his well-rounded personality and strong work ethic, he had found his true match in Heidi, whom he met at their shared place of worship, Calvary Church, in 2005. At the ages of 22 and 20, respectively, Nick and Heidi made the joyful decision to take their relationship to the next level. Surrounded by their loved ones in the familiar walls of the church that had witnessed the blossoming of their love, they exchanged vows, sealing their commitment to each other. To their friends and community, Nick and Heidi's marriage appeared perfect. They shared a love for travel, biking, and their church. They often hosted dinner parties for their loved ones. Heidi had recently started working at a financial firm where her father was employed. Their bond seemed to be growing stronger with time. However, behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. On the morning of April 25, 2010, Heidi called 911 from her home in St. Paul, Minnesota, reporting a break-in. Only 38 seconds into the call, Heidi yelled no, and a gunshot was heard. 65 seconds later, Nick used Heidi's phone to contact the dispatcher, saying, "Someone just broke into my house and shot me and my wife." Nick was overcome with grief, repeatedly crying and begging for help, saying, "Oh my Heidi, my wife is dead. Please get here." He also shouted no in despair. When the police arrived, they found Heidi unresponsive on the kitchen floor with a gunshot wound to her back. Nick was beside her, still on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, despite having been shot in the upper left leg. He was extremely upset and told the police that 1 or 2 intruders had broken into their home. According to Nick, he had grabbed his shotgun and tried to escape with Heidi through the back door, heading towards their detached garage. However, the intruder managed to take the shotgun from him and shot both Nick and Heidi. Sadly, Heidi was pronounced dead at the scene, her life cut short by the tragic events. Nick, meanwhile, was rushed to the hospital for treatment and was later questioned by the police while still in the hospital. Police asked Nick why he and Heidi left the safety of their bedroom to face the potential danger. Nick explained that they were trying to escape through the back door. After receiving medical treatment for his wounds at the hospital, Nick was released just 3 hours later and was interviewed again at the police station about the incident. Police station, Nick provided a detailed account of what happened. He recalled watching a movie with Heidi and having a glass of wine before going to bed around midnight. Nick said he woke up around 6:10 to 6:15 a.m. when he heard the screen door open and someone fiddling with the doorknob. The investigators questioned Nick about locking the deadbolt, and he admitted that he and Heidi usually made sure to lock it. But he believed he had forgotten to do so that particular night. After hearing the noises, Nick retrieved his shotgun from the upstairs closet, which he had brought up from the basement a month ago because he noticed it was starting to rust. Although the shotgun was initially empty, Nick loaded it when he heard the noises. He then woke up Heidi, instructed her to call 911, and told her to leave the house and go to the garage. where their cars were parked. Nick also shared that he and Heidi had a safety plan in place in case of trouble, which was to go to the garage where their cars were parked. Nick, who is right-handed, was holding a pair of jeans in his right hand and a shotgun in his left hand as he walked behind Heidi toward the garage. They stopped at the front door, where Heidi retrieved her wallet from a table. Suddenly, the door burst open and a tall, dark-skinned man rushed in. The intruder wore a dark hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled tightly around his face. Nick dropped the jeans and the intruder grabbed the shotgun barrel. The two men then engaged in a physical struggle. During the altercation, the gun fired and Nick said his finger accidentally slipped onto the trigger. He believed he hit Heidi in the back, causing her to collapse immediately. They continued fighting over the shotgun, which fired again, hitting Nick in the upper thigh and causing him to fall to the ground. The intruder then fled out the front door. Nick told investigators that Heidi was unresponsive and he eventually lost consciousness. Nick told the police that his house was supposed to be foreclosed the next day, and he and his partner Heidi had planned to inform their parents and friends about their situation on the same day. According to Nick, they had fallen behind on their bills, and their house had been foreclosed on and sold to someone else. As a result, they were required to vacate the premises, but they hadn't shared this information with anyone. Their plan was to pack up their belongings on Sunday and Monday morning, leaving some items in the garage to collect later and then find someone to stay with temporarily. However, their plans were disrupted, and their peaceful home was left with an air of tragedy. The lives of Nick and Heidi were forever changed by the devastating events of that morning. The investigation continued with law enforcement securing the area and interviewing residents. None of the neighbors reported seeing anyone leaving the Furca's residence. However, one neighbor, Brendan O'Connell, who was looking after kittens in a nearby house, told the authorities that he heard an argument followed by gunfire. Nick begged for mercy, claiming a shooter had attacked him and a woman. After talking to police, Nick's lawyer hired an artist to update the sketch. Details emerging: an African-American male, 40 to 60 years old. The police initially searched for an unknown African-American male intruder based on Nick's description, but found no evidence or witnesses to support his story. Despite a thorough investigation, no one was arrested or charged in connection with Heidi's death, leaving the case unsolved for many years. Years later, a surprising revelation came to light. Over 10 years had passed since Heidi's murder, and Nick had seemingly moved on with his life, marrying Rachel and starting a family. However, when financial troubles resurfaced, Rachel began to suspect that Nick was hiding something. Rachel's concerns about their financial situation and Nick's evasiveness sparked her curiosity, prompting her to investigate Nick's past. As she dug deeper, she uncovered secrets and inconsistencies that made her question everything she thought she knew about her husband and his possible involvement in Heidi's death. Rachel was unaware of the financial troubles her husband Nick was hiding, similar to those he had faced with his previous wife Heidi years earlier. Her concerns prompted her to contact the authorities, which renewed interest in Heidi's murder case. Investigators began looking into Nick's second marriage to Rachel, whom he married in 2012. However, by the time Rachel spoke with the authorities, she had already divorced Nick due to his growing financial problems. Before their 2019 divorce, Rachel had recorded a conversation where she confronted Nick about his deception. She told investigators that Nick was repeating the same patterns he had with Heidi, including failing to pay property taxes. In fact, she had seen a letter warning that they would be evicted by 2020 if the taxes weren't paid. Rachel's decision to contact the police with her suspicions set off a chain of events that would once again bring the Heidi Fergus murder case into the spotlight. Sergeant Nicole Sipes, assigned to the case, listened carefully to Rachel's concerns and began re-examining the evidence. Sergeant Nicole Sykes of the St. Paul Police Department was determined to solve Heidi's murder. To uncover the truth, she made a bold decision to ask the FBI to analyze the 911 call audio recordings. She hoped to find crucial clues that could explain what happened on the night of the murder. The FBI's analysis yielded a surprising result. It found no evidence of a third person being present during the incident. This discovery contradicted the husband's earlier statement to the police, leaving Sergeant Sipes and her team puzzled. If only Heidi and her husband were in the house, what led to her death? The absence of a third person increased suspicion around the husband's possible involvement in the crime. Sergeant Sipes was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and bring justice to Heidi and her grieving family. The FBI's findings opened up a new avenue of investigation, which Sergeant Sipes was committed to pursuing with increased intensity. The investigators obtained financial documents that disputed Nicholas Fergus' earlier statements, further implicating him in Heidi's murder. Fergus' account of the events surrounding Heidi's death kept changing. Initially, he claimed that an intruder took his gun and shot both him and Heidi. Later, he said that the intruder didn't take the gun, but his own finger accidentally pulled the trigger, hitting Heidi in the back. The crime scene investigation yielded no signs of a struggle, such as overturned furniture or marks on the walls, contradicting Fergus' account. Forensic analysis of the scene also disputed Fergus' version of the shooting, particularly the trajectory of the bullet that struck Heidi. Furthermore, Heidi's 911 call made no mention of an intruder, and there was no evidence of a break-in or intruder at the crime scene. This lack of evidence led investigators to suspect that Fergus had planned to cover up his involvement in Heidi's death. As a result, an arrest warrant was issued for Nick Fergus on May 19, 2021, over a decade after Heidi's death. A SWAT team arrested Fergus at his home in Mounds View. The surprise arrest of Nick stemmed from Rachel's suspicions and the tireless efforts of Police Sergeant Nicole Sipes. This sudden development astonished many who thought the case had stalled and would never reach a resolution. As the legal proceedings progressed, the case details would be re-examined and the truth about that fateful night would gradually emerge. At the trial, Nick Fergus maintained that he was innocent and pleaded not guilty. Many of his family members, including his father, claimed to believe in his innocence, stating that Nick's love for Heidi would have prevented him from committing such a violent act. However, the jury disagreed with their assessment. On February 10, 2023, the jury delivered a shocking verdict after deliberating for 10 hours. They found Nick, person Heidi trusted most, guilty of her brutal murder. This outcome left everyone who knew Heidi in a state of shock and disbelief. The prosecution built a strong case against Nick by showing that he was facing severe financial difficulties, which they argued led him to kill Heidi to avoid shame and conflict. They questioned the truth of Nick's claim that a home invader was responsible, suggesting that he fabricated the story to divert attention from himself. The prosecution presented convincing evidence, including the lack of signs of forced entry and inconsistencies in Nick's account. Notably, there was no DNA or physical evidence to support the presence of an intruder, which raised serious doubts about Nick's story. Prosecutor Rachel Craker argued that Nick's inability to accept the truth of his financial deception led him to commit a shocking crime, sacrificing Heidi's life to preserve his reputation. In contrast, Nick's defense attorney Robert Richmond countered that it didn't make sense for Nick's financial problems to suddenly drive him to murder. Nick claimed that killing his wife would somehow boost his reputation, but this statement is illogical. After intense debates during the trial, the jury finally reached a verdict that would determine whether Nick would be held accountable for Heidi's death. The jury carefully considered the evidence, emotional testimonies, and legal arguments before delivering a unanimous verdict. Nick Fergus was guilty of first-degree murder. On April 13, 2023, the judge handed down the most severe sentence possible, life in prison without parole. Although found guilty, Nick still insists he had nothing to do with Heidi's death. He maintains his innocence even after being sentenced. When he was sentenced, Nick said, "I understand the pain and loss felt by everyone here today. Justice has been served, but it came at a great cost. A broken family, a betrayed community, and a life cut short." The verdict brought a sense of closure to Heidi's family and friends, but it also left them with the painful realization that the man they thought they knew was capable of such a heinous act. So, you must be thinking, where is Nick now? Nick is currently serving his life sentence at the Minnesota Correctional Facility, located in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Here's what drove Nick to commit the tragic act. The motive behind the killing remains unclear, but there are clues. In June 2009, Nick received foreclosure papers on their house, which was then sold at a sheriff's auction the same month. 10 months before Heidi's death, eviction proceedings began in February 2010, with a hearing scheduled for March 8, 2010. Nick attended the hearing alone. Initially, the lockout was set for April 9, 2010, but Nick called the attorneys, claiming his grandmother was in the hospital and about to die. He requested the lockout be rescheduled for April 26, 2010. However, investigators found no evidence to support this claim. When questioned, Nick said Heidi was aware of their financial troubles and that they had made plans together to move out of their foreclosed home and start fresh elsewhere. The truth behind a tragic event was finally revealed by prosecutors. A husband, Nick, had been hiding their severe financial struggles from his wife, Heidi. Tragically, before she could discover the truth, he took her life. Instead of being honest with his wife and working together to find a solution, Nick chose a devastating path. According to prosecutors, Nick's motive for killing his wife was his shame and fear of revealing their financial problems, which included $118,000 in credit card debt and 22 months of late mortgage payments. By killing Heidi, Nick avoided confronting the consequences of his own deception. In the end, justice was served, but Heidi's loved ones still suffered immense pain and loss. Unfortunately, no legal punishment could undo the harm or bring back the vibrant life that was cruelly taken. An almost 47-year-old mystery has now been resolved. A 16-year-old girl named Carol Sue Klaber was found strangled to death on June 5, 1976, shocking her family and the entire community of northern Kentucky. Despite years of investigation, there were no leads or suspects, and the case remained unsolved until new technology played a key role in putting the puzzle together. Who could have harmed Carol Sue Klaber in this way? And how did the murderer escape justice for such a long time? Kentucky in the United States is home to the county of Boone. Boone County was established in 1798 and was named after Daniel Boone. The Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport, a key hub for the area, is located in Boone County, which is the fourth most populous county in Kentucky. Burlington serves as the county seat, and the county is well known for its historical sites, outdoor recreation areas, and robust agricultural sector. However, a tragic murder would occur in this area of Boone in 1976. On November 28, 1959, a new life was born into the world in the state of Kentucky. Daniel Henry Klaber and Betty Jane Meek Reniker, her proud parents, were beaming with pride as they held their adorable baby girl in their arms and gave her the name Carol Sue Klaber. Thomas Klaber, her older brother, watched on in wonder, excited to welcome his new sister into the family. Was incredibly funny. She had a great deal of empathy for those who were less fortunate and was surprisingly modest for a teenager. At the age of 16, she volunteered at St. Charles Nursing Home. In her younger years, Carol had also been a Brownie and a Girl Scout. She loved to sew, cook, play records, and listen to music constantly. She began taking piano lessons when she was 5 years old. Carol was chosen by her piano teacher, Hattie Schatzman, to represent her students at the Ohio Music Teacher Association, while she was also learning how to play the violin. She had performed 2 times at the Taft Museum. She was a beloved member of the Dixie Heights High School String Ensemble, thanks to her love of music and natural talent, and her classmates were drawn to her outgoing and kind nature. Sadly, her family, friends, and teachers won't be able to see much of her talents anymore as a tragedy soon befell Carol. On June 5, 1976, as the sun rose and shined brightly over the Kentucky town of Union, Dr. Gaines Huey, a respected Walton dentist who was ready to attend to his patients' dental needs, left his home early in the morning as the neighborhood's residents started their days as usual. As Dr. Gaines traveled down Chamber Road, he noticed something unusual at the road's edge. He soon stopped his car out of curiosity and moved toward the thing. It wasn't until he was close enough that he realized what he had discovered. There was a body lying eerily still next to a culvert that served as a rainwater drainage pipe. Dr. Gaines, who was in a state of shock, immediately dialed the Kentucky State Police with trembling hands. Jan Wushner just so happened to be working that day. Jan Wushner, An experienced detective who had previously worked for the Boone County Sheriff's Department hurried to the scene in order to solve the mystery surrounding the dead body that was lying by the roadside. Around 7:15 a.m., detectives from the Walton State Police Department arrived at the crime scene. With a keen eye for detail, their eyes swept the area where the body was. The detectives started their investigation after spotting the obvious indications of a struggle. Broken twigs and trampled grass suggested a violent altercation between the victim and her attacker. After being viciously attacked, the victim, who was a female, was strangled to death. As their sense of dread increased, the investigators grimly realized that this was a murder rather than a random act of violence. Despite their best efforts and their determination to search every possible angle in their pursuit of justice, the investigators were unable to uncover any tangible evidence at the crime scene. They then settled to look for information on the victim's body. Her body was taken to the county medical examiner's office so that a thorough autopsy could be performed. The medical examiner meticulously performed an autopsy, searching every square inch of the victim's body for clues. Every wound, scrape, and cut was meticulously recorded, and each hint was carefully examined. The gruesome details of her death were made clear by the autopsy findings. According to the evidence, she had endured a brutal beating. Her body was marked by the obvious effects of a tire iron used with relentless force. The once beautiful face was now deformed by swelling and bruising, and the examiner observed the woman's deep scalp wounds, which were probably caused by a blunt object. She had suffered an irreparable head injury from the crushing blow, which had tragically and prematurely ended her life. There were also obvious indications of physical brutality and abuse. All those involved experienced a heartbreaking moment, and the cause of death was finally identified as asphyxia brought on by manual strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. The investigation took on a new level of urgency after the discovery of such viciousness. Investigators found some traces of foreign DNA on the victim's clothing while examining the scene's evidence. They did their best to match it to someone at the time, but they failed. They, however, carefully stored the evidence in the anticipation of future technological developments, confident that it might someday result in a breakthrough in the investigation. With the aid of DNA taken from the victim's body and their tireless efforts, detectives were able to track down the victim's brother. He mustered the courage to approach the body and identify it as his sister. Thomas Klaber, who was 23 years old at the time, entered the morgue as he stood in front of his beloved sister, Carol Sue Klaber's lifeless body on a cold metal table. His face was dripping with tears, realizing that he would never again get to see his sister's radiant smile or hear her contagious laughter. The pain in his heart was unbearable. The investigators searched every possible lead as the investigation developed. They scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors, talking to locals, and gathering any details that might shed light on the tragic incident. In order to understand Carol Sue Klaber's life and potential enemies better, they also dug deeply into her past and spoke to her family and friends. The investigators discovered that for the Klaber family, June 4th, 1976, was a typical day. Getting on her bike, Carol Sue Klaber, a 16-year-old carefree teen, got on her bike and pedaled around town with a smile on her face as the wind blew her hair. She said hello to the neighborhood residents, talked with friends, and enjoyed the warmth of the summer day. She has arranged to meet a friend at Zeno's Hyde Park restaurant later on in the evening. She left her house at 5:30 p.m., but as dusk fell, a young man driving a swanky Chevrolet Monte Carlo followed Klaber back to her house. One of the neighbors claimed to have caught a glimpse of the young man, who was towering at 6 feet tall with a slim build. He had sandy blonde hair. The man and Carol spoke briefly before Carol entered the home, leaving the man outside in anticipation. A short while later, Carol came out from the house, hopped in the car, and left with the man. That appeared to have been the last time anyone would ever see Carol alive again. The murder of Carol Sue Klaber went unsolved despite the investigators' best efforts to find the owner of the suspected vehicle. The case wasn't moving ahead and every lead had been exhausted, leaving the detectives baffled. The case eventually became unsolved, and it remained that way for more than 40 years. A ray of hope appeared in the Carol Sue Klaber murder investigation after years of no progress. Coy Cox and Timothy Adams, two cold case detectives from the Boone County Sheriff's Office, gave the case new life in 2017. In their relentless pursuit of the truth and justice for Carol Sue Klaber, these two detectives teamed up with Jerry Keith, the first detective on the case, who had kept it so dear to his heart even after retiring. The trio used cutting-edge technology to work nonstop. In order to put together a fresh perspective on the tragedy that had baffled them for years, they painstakingly went through the old evidence, speaking with witnesses and sifting through leads. The two top suspects that Keith had earlier named were the focus of their initial investigation. The first suspect was a man with a history of auto theft, whose car had a startling resemblance to the one Carol was last seen in. The detective targeted this man and examined him closely in an effort to elicit any useful information from him. The man, who was a suspect in the investigation, denied any involvement in Carol's killing. He disclosed his past crimes to the detectives as he opened up to them, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence in Carol's murder. In order to compare his DNA to the DNA that was discovered in 1976 from the victim's clothing, the detectives collected his DNA. The results of the DNA analysis arrived in December 2018 after a long wait. Finally, Detectives Cox and Adams called the man to let him know that his DNA results were negative and he was no longer a suspect in Carol's murder. On hearing this, the man realized he could finally breathe easily and begin his life afresh. He felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. Following the DNA results, Cox and Adams returned to their tenacious hunt for the murderer. They were back at square one because the leads on their initial suspect had run dry. Then, in 2020, they made the decision to turn to their second suspect, who had already been found guilty of a vicious sexual assault in the same neighborhood just 2 years prior to Carol's murder. In 2020, he was 77 years old and went by the name Michael Dean Tate. Cox and Adams contacted Michael Dean Tate's assault victim from 1978 for her account of the assault as they worked to establish their case against him. She didn't reveal her name, but she remembered the night clearly. She described the frightening darkness of the Park Hills on the night of October 1, 1978, when she was viciously attacked at around 2 in the morning in her own garage. The victim remembered that despite her best efforts to fight and scream, her attacker seemed to take a sick pleasure in hurting her. But after 2 hours of hell, the attacker fled, leaving her wounded but still alive. Years passed before she was able to overcome the psychological and physical scars Tate had left behind on that fateful night. Cox and Adams were forced to consider the possibility that Tate might have been connected to the murder of Carol after learning about his involvement in the 1978 case. The detectives considered Tate as a prime suspect in Carol's murder case because he frequently traveled to the area for work in the 1970s and 1980s. Tate nevertheless maintained his innocence and denied any involvement in Carol's death despite the detectives' evidence against him. The detectives had hoped that their investigation would eventually point them in the direction of the offender. Their hopes were quickly dashed, though, when Tate's DNA was not found as a match to the DNA at the crime scene. Tate was also living in Cincinnati in 1976, according to court records, which ruled out his involvement in the crime. The detectives wondered if they would ever be able to solve this long-running case, which had lain dormant for nearly 50 years. The case remained unsolved until the Boone County Sheriff's Office contacted Othram Lab on September 17, 2022, because of their expertise in genetic genealogy. The Kentucky State Police Central Forensic Center sent a DNA sample from the 1976 crime scene to Othram Labs with funding from the Season of Justice. A team of expert scientists in Othram was able to create a complete DNA profile for the real suspect using advanced forensic-grade genome sequencing. With the aid of advanced technology, they were able to access priceless genetic data that had been kept secret for many years. Based on the comprehensive DNA profile they had created, the forensic genetic genealogy experts at Othram Labs used genealogy to generate leads for investigations. In a startling turn of events, Othram Labs provided a response on November 25, 2022, less than 2 months after receiving the DNA samples. By examining the genetic data left by the murderer, they identified a link to a man named Thomas W. Dunaway, who had passed away in 1990 at the age of 33. More research revealed that Dunaway had a son, but the boy had never met his father. Investigators made the trip to meet with Thomas Dunaway's son, whose identity was kept secret, in order to collect DNA samples for comparison. The outcomes of these significant laboratory examinations would hold the key to unlocking the mystery that had long eluded law enforcement. Detectives meticulously gathered the required samples with a desire to learn the truth and a firm commitment to justice. In January 2023, the case's lengthy investigation came to a conclusion. After nearly 47 years, Carol Sue Klaber and her family received justice when Dunaway's son's DNA partially matched the traces of DNA they had discovered on Carol's body years earlier. This was made possible by the use of cutting-edge technology and the detectives' dogged determination for justice. Although the process was difficult, the perseverance of those involved had paid off, leading to a discovery that would provide comfort to everyone impacted by the tragic events of 1976. The Carol Sue Klaber murder case was never given up on by the police. Thomas W. Dunaway, who was 19 years old at the time and was born on May 20, 1957, was able to remain undiscovered for a very long time. Detectives were able to learn important details about Dunaway's past and the terrible things he had done by being persistent and keeping an open mind. When Carol was last seen at her home with a man who resembled him, the police learned that he resided close to Davo Park. As they dug deeper, more negative information about Dunaway came to light. Dunaway was a persistent criminal. His 6-month crime spree had left a trail of evidence in the form of the vehicles he had driven away from each crime scene. Just 6 months after Carol Sue Klaber's death, in December 1976, he was found responsible for another murder. So the horror did not end there. Ronald Townsend, who was only 19 years old, was discovered lying on the ground shot to death. The news devastated the neighborhood, but Thomas Dunaway's capture and admission of guilt in Townsend's murder helped lift people's. Dunaway received a life sentence, but sadly, he was only imprisoned for 7.5 years before being released in 1984. His release made the community wonder if justice could really be served. The terrifying pattern of violence and darkness that consumed Dunaway's life was revealed by Detective Coy Cox. Although Carol's murder may not have resulted in justice, the police were able to reveal the full scope of Dunaway's lethal and dangerous reign of terror. Ronald Townsend and Carol Sue Klaber murders both had unsettling similarities. Just a few inches from the road, both victims were left in full view as if the murderer were making a point. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned Dunaway was absent without leave from the army at the time of Townsend's murder. 9 days after Carol's murder, Dunaway had joined the military and was initially assigned to Fort Knox before being transferred to Fort Carson in Colorado. Thomas Dunaway, who had joined the military, couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. Dunaway had an unrivaled love for cars, but it ultimately brought him to ruin. He traded his beloved 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo for a striking orange Chevrolet Vega because he had an eye for a good deal. He had no idea, though, that the detectives looking into the murder of Ronald Townsend would be drawn specifically to this flashy car. Dunaway and his orange Vega were the targets of an all-points bulletin that the detectives relentlessly pursued. On the gloomy Christmas Eve of 1976, Dunaway was apprehended in South Carolina on suspicion of Townsend's murder and an unlawful possession of a firearm, putting an end to a long game of cat and mouse. The relationship between Carol Sue Klaber and Thomas Dunaway has investigators perplexed as they look deeper into the mysterious case of Carol Sue Klaber's murder. It's possible that Carol and Dunaway ran into each other when they were young and attended Erlanger-Ellesmer schools, but it's not clear how they ended up connected. However, in the midst of the confusion, Detective Coy Cox provided a crucial hint that might help solve the mystery. It's possible that Carol's love for the Vow Park led to a chance meeting with Dunaway. The park held a special place in Carol's heart. She had a reputation for being extroverted, so it's possible that's how she met him. Maybe they just happened to cross paths in the park, and as they laughed and shared stories in the calm environment, they became acquainted. There is no doubt that the park is significant to their relationship because Dunaway lived close to where Carol used to ride her bike. There was a mixture of relief and sorrow following the identification of Thomas Dunaway as Carol Sue Klaber's murderer. The news that Dunaway passed away on December 28, 1990 at the young age of 33, left the family feeling conflicted. even though the authorities consider the case to be closed. Even though the Klaber family is aware of the truth, justice still seems elusive to them. Thomas Klaber bemoaned that he couldn't help but wonder what justice meant anymore and wished he could have confronted Dunaway before his death. Thomas Klaber has been haunted by the memory of his sister's murder. He has carried this burden for almost 50 years, never being able to completely let go of the worry that his family might experience another tragedy. He calls his 28-year-old son, Daniel, late at night because he is so concerned about his safety. Like he lost his beloved sister, he is afraid of losing anyone else who is important to him. It's a fear that holds him in a vice-like grip and serves as a constant reminder of how fleeting life is and how vital it is to cherish the people we care about. The thought of disturbing his sister's final resting place was intolerable to Thomas Klaber. His heart ached at the thought of disturbing her peaceful sleep in order to find her killer. Thankfully, investigators discovered an alternate route. They succeeded in exhuming the body of Carol Sue's killer instead of her remains. The fact that his sister can finally find peace and the small victories are what matter most to Thomas. The recent court order for Detective Cox to exhume Dunaway's body for DNA testing is proof that his commitment to seeking justice knew no bounds. Detective Cox was prepared to face whatever challenges lie ahead. The procedure of entering the DNA into Cody's may be just the start of a new chapter in the pursuit of justice. After almost 50 years, Carol Sue Klaber received her justice. Lewis Kelly, the Commonwealth's attorney for Boone County, has declared the case closed even though her killer cannot be tried in a court of law. Detective Cox's eyes welled up with tears as he shared the bittersweet moment of telling Carol's brother that the murderer had finally been found after all these years. Even though the past cannot be changed, the satisfaction that comes from knowing the truth provides some solace in the wake of such a tragedy. After 46 years, Detective Coy Cox and his team have finally put Carol Sue Klaber's murder mystery to rest by mentioning Thomas W. Dunaway as the offender. This case demonstrates how committed law enforcement is to seeking justice for victims and their families, regardless of the length of time that may elapse. The case of Chris Coleman. Chris Coleman, a former Marine, met his wife Sherry, an Air Force member, while serving in the military. Sherry instantly fell in love with Chris and knew he was the one. They got married before their first child, Garrett, was born, as they were devout Christians. After Garrett's birth, they had their second son, Gavin. Gavin was more energetic and mischievous, unlike his laid-back father and brother. Chris and Sherry were devoted parents who cherished their children. Sherry protected them fiercely while Chris enjoyed every moment with them. When Chris left the military, the family moved to Waterloo, Illinois, where Chris worked as the head of security for TV evangelist Joyce Meyer. Joyce's luxurious lifestyle sparked controversy with critics accusing her of exploiting her followers' fears. Chris' job was to protect Joyce from threatening letters and hate mail. He worked as her bodyguard and earned a substantial salary, providing financial security for his family. However, his frequent travels with Joyce put a strain on his family as he was away from home for long periods. His sons deeply missed him, and his wife Sherry felt overwhelmed, underappreciated, and burdened with household responsibilities. In October 2008, Chris went to Florida, where his wife grew up, and met with an old friend, Tara Lintz, who gave him a tour of the city. Days later, Chris received a disturbing email from an address called Destroy Chris, warning him that he and his family would be in danger if he continued to work for Joyce Meyer. The ministry received more threatening emails specifying a time and date for the potential attack on Chris's family. The emails seemed to have inside information on Chris's schedule, including his upcoming trip abroad. Chris told Sherry about the threatening emails he had been receiving, and on the following Monday, he reported them to the local police. As Chris often worked away from home with Joyce Meyer Ministries, the police offered to increase patrols around their house during his absences. But this did little to alleviate Sherry's fear for her family's safety. Sherry's concern was so great that she once asked a friend to stay with her while Chris was away, as she didn't feel comfortable being alone in the house. She emphasized that she would do whatever it took to keep her family safe. 2 months into the threats, the Colemans received a disturbing, hand-delivered letter demanding that Chris publicly renounce his faith or face severe consequences. The letter's ominous tone left Sherry genuinely fearful for her family's safety. The threat had a profound impact on Sherry, and her fear grew daily. To respond to the threat, Chris and Sherry took extra precautions to protect their family, including installing surveillance cameras around their home, which captured footage of the surrounding area and sent it to a screen in their basement office. Chris hoped the cameras would help identify the person behind the threats. After the cameras were installed, the threats suddenly stopped and life returned to normal for the family. For a few months, everything seemed fine. However, in April 2009, the family received another disturbing letter warning that Sherry's worst fears were about to come true. Chris was deeply disturbed by the letter's ominous tone. After reviewing the security footage, Chris was shocked to see a mysterious silhouette. Although the figure's identity remained unknown, its presence reignited Chris's concerns for his family's safety. The renewed sense of fear led to increased police efforts to protect the Coleman family. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow from the Columbia Police Department took a particular interest in the case and offered to help the family. He set up video cameras to monitor the Coleman's driveway, but unfortunately, they did not catch the person behind the threats. On May 5, 2009, Chris went to the gym and then called his home phone to check on Sherry and the boys, making sure they were up and getting ready for school. Chris called for help, but no one responded. Concerned, he phoned his neighbor, Detective Justin Barlow, at 6:45 a.m. Chris told Barlow that he had left for the gym in St. Louis County around 5:30 a.m. and had been trying to reach his wife Sherry, but she wasn't answering her phone. Worried, Chris asked Barlow to check on Sherry and their sons. Barlow grabbed his gear, including his weapon, handcuffs, flashlight, and radio, and headed to the Coleman house. As he waited for backup to arrive, his priority was to make contact with Sherry and ensure everyone's safety. With a mix of hope and unease, Barlow approached the door and knocked firmly, hoping someone would respond. When Detective Justin Barlow arrived at the Coleman home, the eerie silence and darkness made him feel uneasy. The lack of movement and lights inside the house heightened his sense of unease. Minutes later, a patrol vehicle arrived with another officer to assist him. The second officer went to the back of the house to try to see or communicate with Sherry or the boys through a window or door. Instead, he found signs of forced entry into the basement, which immediately grabbed Detective Barlow's attention. He became deeply concerned for Sherry Garrett and Gavin's safety. Detective Barlow and the second officer decided to enter the house through the basement, announcing their presence as they went. But they received no response. During their thorough search of the basement, they found a disconnected video cable at the computer desk. This discovery led them to believe that the camera's digital video recorder was missing. Detective Justin Barlow and the second officer searched the Coleman home from the basement up, noticing a strong smell of aerosol spray paint that grew stronger as they climbed the stairs. On the main level, they found the walls painted with derogatory messages targeting Chris, Sherry, and their sons. 13 minutes after Chris called the detective, Chris returned home from the gym and was told to wait outside while the officers searched the house. He complied, sitting quietly on the porch without asking questions or trying to enter. Meanwhile, a third officer arrived and the three of them searched the rest of the house for Sherry and the boys. On the upper floors, they found more hate-filled spray-painted messages. When they reached the second story, Detective Barlow entered the bedroom of Garrett, the oldest son, where he appeared to be asleep. However, upon closer inspection, the detective realized that Garrett was dead, with no signs of life and a cold body. Ligature marks around his neck indicated that he had been murdered. Detectives' minds were shocked when they found Garrett's lifeless body. Next door, the second officer entered to check on Gavin, and was horrified to discover the boy was also dead, strangled with ligature marks around his neck, just like his brother. The gruesome scene was made even more disturbing by an obscene message spray-painted on the bedsheets. In the master bedroom, the third officer found Sherry's lifeless body on the bed, her hair covering her face. It was clear she had been murdered. As the officer examined the room, he noticed Sherry's body had several bruises, indicating she had fought back and tried to defend herself and her sons. After discovering the bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, detectives, including Justin Barlow, heard Chris enter the house, having waited outside for news about his family. Detective Barlow took Chris outside to give him some privacy to process the news. However, as the reality of the situation sank in, Chris's reaction was intense. He felt sick, collapsed, and curled up into a fetal position, unable to contain his emotions. The shock of the brutal murders was too much for him to comprehend. Chris was in disbelief that his family had been taken away in such a violent manner. In desperation, he tried to reach out to his father, Ronald, telling him that something had happened to Sherry and the boys. Ronald immediately realized that Chris was in shock upon receiving the news. Ronald was stunned by the tragedy that had befallen his family. The shocking news of the murders of Sherry Garrett and Gavin spread quickly throughout the community of Waterloo, Illinois, where the Coleman family lived. As the neighbors learned of the tragedy, they were left devastated and terrified. Chris expressed remorse for leaving his family alone to go to the gym. But when asked if he had any idea who might have committed the crime, he claimed to have no clue. Nevertheless, Detective Barlow noticed several suspicious behaviors during the interview. One red flag was Chris' lack of curiosity about the details of his family's murder, which seemed unusual given the gravity of the situation. The detective noticed Chris trying to hide scratches on his arms during the interview, even using a blanket to conceal them despite the warm temperature. The scratches were suspicious because they suggested Chris had been in a physical struggle, similar to Sherry's fight with her killer. When asked about the scratches, Chris claimed they came from installing a satellite dish the day before. He denied having an affair during the police interview, but did admit to a close friendship with Tara, a cocktail waitress and high school friend of his wife's who lived in Florida. Chris said his conversations with Tara were innocent, but wouldn't have been approved by his wife. He insisted he would never consider leaving his family for Tara. However, when detectives contacted Tara, her story contradicted Chris. She revealed that they had been having an affair since November 2008. Tara provided evidence from her phone and laptop, including emails, explicit pictures, and videos that exposed the true nature of their relationship. When detectives confronted Chris with the information Tara had provided, he admitted to seeing her more frequently than he initially told them. Further investigation revealed that Chris and Tara had a secret arrangement to meet at locations where Chris worked for Joyce Meyer. They would sneak away together, often to exotic destinations like Hawaii, to spend time together without their family's knowledge. Although Chris claimed that his relationship with Tara was not an affair, detectives found evidence on Tara's phone and computer that suggested otherwise. Tara had marked a wedding to Chris on her calendar, as well as planned vacations with him, indicating that she believed Chris intended to leave his family for her. The detectives were suspicious of Chris because the evidence contradicted his claim that his relationship with Tara was casual. Chris' father, Ronald, was shocked to learn about the affair, but he firmly believed that it was unrelated to the murders of Chris' wife and son. According to Ronald, Chris was a gentle person who was not capable of such brutal crimes. Ronald described Chris as a quiet individual who showed no signs of violence. However, the detectives thought that Chris's affair with Tara was a strong motive for the murders. Despite this, their initial investigation did not find enough evidence to charge Chris with the crime. After being questioned for 6 hours, Chris was released without being charged. Tara became a person of interest in the investigation, but she was eventually cleared as a suspect when it was discovered that she was in Florida on the morning of May 5, 2009, when the murders occurred. The Coleman family murders led to one of the largest murder investigations in Illinois history. A special team of 25 detectives was formed to catch the person who killed the Coleman family. They worked extremely long hours, often 20 hours a day, for 15 days straight, calling in experts to help with the case. One of their main goals was to find out who sent the hateful emails to Chris Coleman. They carefully looked at every threatening email sent to Joyce Meyer Ministries over the past year, which led them to investigate leads all over the country. The team tracked down and talked to every person who sent threatening emails, but none of them seemed to be responsible for the murder. A team of computer experts was then brought in to help investigate the crime. The detectives hoped they could find some digital evidence related to the murder. The computer experts started by looking at the email account, Diarist, They found that the email address was created on November 14, 2008, just a few days before the first threatening email was sent. One surprising thing they discovered was that the death threats sent to Chris Coleman's family came from Chris's own computer IP address. The detectives thoroughly examined the spray-painted messages at the crime scene and compared them to Christopher Coleman's handwriting to gather evidence. They took photos of the messages and collected handwriting samples from Coleman, which were then sent to a specialist for analysis. The expert's comparison of the two samples revealed a match, indicating that Christopher Coleman had written the messages on his home's walls on the day of the murders. Further analysis identified the specific brand and color of spray paint used, Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red. After learning that Chris Coleman had bought something from a hardware store just days before his family's murder, a detective contacted the store's manager. The manager confirmed the purchase and revealed that Chris had bought Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red spray paint, the same type found at the crime scene. This discovery was crucial because it established a link between Chris and the murder. The timeline of the murder was also important. Chris initially claimed to have left his house around 5:45 a.m. on May 5, 2009, but the medical examiner determined that the murders occurred around 3 a.m., which meant Chris was at home when his family was killed. 2 weeks after the bodies were found, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that Chris's motivations were greed, selfishness, and narcissism, and that he wanted a fresh start, but his family was standing in the way. In April 2011, Chris Coleman stood trial for the murders of his wife, Sherry, and their 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin. The prosecution argued that Chris killed his family to be with another woman, Tara, as he would lose his well-paying job with Joyce Meyer Ministries if he divorced Sherry, since the organization does not condone divorce. Chris's defense attorney claimed that an intruder entered the Coleman's home on May 5, 2009, and committed the murders. However, 2 years later, on the anniversary of the murders, Chris was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole, despite being eligible for a death sentence. The judge's decision was influenced by the recent repeal of the death penalty in Illinois, which would take effect a few months later. Sherry's loved ones wanted to keep her, Garrett and Gavin's memory alive and decided to raise funds for victims of domestic violence, a cause close to their hearts. 2-year-old Mary Agnes Maroney disappeared in the bustling city of Chicago on a chilly day in November 1930. Her disappearance baffled authorities for 93 years, and her family members were left devastated. This case of decades-lost child is confusing. Mary Agnes Maroney's enigmatic disappearance made international news for years. False leads and pointless discoveries failed for almost a century to locate the child and reunite her with her family. But over time, the puzzle's pieces started to line up. Mary Agnes Maroney's case remained unsolved despite numerous DNA tests, suspicious letters, sighting reports, and reported sightings until 2023, when a Californian woman came forward with the solution to the long-standing puzzle. Stay with us as we reveal the shocking details surrounding Mary's disappearance and the surprising turn of events that resulted in the resolution of her case. Mary Agnes Maroney was born to Catherine and Michael Maroney in Chicago, Illinois, on May 9, 1928. In the depths of poverty during the Great Depression, they were a family struggling to get by. Mary had a younger sister named Anastasia, who was only 11 months old at the time. Mary and her family lived in an apartment on the 2nd floor above a supermarket at 5200 Wentworth Avenue. Michael Maroney distributed handbills to earn his meager weekly salary of only $15. The Maroneys were having a difficult time. In the midst of their financial struggles, one of Catherine Maroney's relatives became interested in the family story. This relative took the initiative to get in touch with a welfare organization, and as a result, an advertisement about their financial struggles was publicized. Shortly after, Edgar Gilpin, a self-described male nurse and philanthropist, responded to the advertisement on May 13, 1930, on a Wednesday night. He offers Michael help in the form of a suit and some shoes. Since the addresses of families in need were kept secret from the public, the family accepted the offer through the welfare organization. But due to a small error, a mysterious woman learned the Maroney family's address. They had no idea that this seemingly insignificant mistake would trigger a tragic chain of events that would alter their lives for good. On May 14, 1930, Catherine Maroney, who was 17 years old at the time, was at home by herself with Mary Agnes and Anastasia. She heard a knock at the door as she was mopping the floor. When she goes to answer the door, a nicely dressed woman who identified herself as Mrs. Henderson and claimed to be a representative of the social worker who had seen the Maroney family's advertisement for assistance, was standing at the doorstep. She had just brought inside some groceries she had bought from the downstairs grocery store for $2.55. Mary Agnes, who was typically reserved, quickly warmed up to the woman as Catherine described their family's hardship to her. The woman appeared friendly and eager to assist while listening intently. She said her aging husband had passed away, leaving her with a sizable fortune. A child like Mary Agnes was something else she mentioned wanting. She then requested that Mary Agnes be temporarily taken to California with her while assuring Catherine that the young girl would be as chubby as a butterball. Catherine struggled to overcome her unease. She politely turned down the woman's offer, and the woman seemed to have accepted the mother's decision. The woman soon left and assured Catherine she would be back the following day. Catherine asked for her name, and the woman reluctantly identified herself as Julia Otis. Julia gave Catherine $2 and 2 books before she left as a sign of support. The next day, on May 14, 1930, even though it was raining, Julia Otis went back to the Maroney's house. She brought fresh baby clothes this time for Catherine, who was at the time expecting her 3rd child. Later, it was found that Julia had bought these clothes from a department store with a brand new $50 bill. She offered to drive Mary Agnes to a clothes-buy shop so she could buy new clothes and shoes, and claimed to have found her father a better job. Catherine reluctantly agreed to let Mary Agnes go with her because she was appreciative of the woman's generosity and thought of her as a blessing. Julia Otis took little Mary away and left in spite of her sobs and tantrums. The two, however, disappeared without a trace. Catherine and Michael turned to the police for assistance as they searched desperately for their beloved daughter. They searched for traces, but none were discovered. On the same evening, an elderly man in shabby clothing who claimed to be a welfare worker showed up at the Maroney home. Catherine reported him to the police because she was uncomfortable with his presence. The men tried to stop her from making the call through to the police, but failed and eventually ran away. He was never identified or found. Julia Otis was described by Catherine as a pleasant and attractive woman, around the age of 22, standing at around 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing 125 pounds. She spoke with a refined voice and had visible front teeth. Julia was dressed in a gray suit, a gray lace hat, a pearl necklace, and a jeweled wristwatch when they last saw each other. At around 8 p.m. the following day, on May 16th, a letter from Julia Otis arrived at the Maroney residence. The letter was written on letterhead, and the postmark on it showed that it was delivered at 4:30 p.m. It came with a $5 bill and was delivered via special delivery. The letter read, "Please don't be alarmed. I have taken your little girl to California with me. I have hired a special nurse to care for her. We'll be back in 2 months. By that time, you will be on your feet again and will be able to care for her." She didn't even cry a bit. She is outfitted like a princess. In the meantime, I'll help all I can to get you on your feet. Don't worry about anything else. When you get this letter, we'll be on our way already. As ever, Julia Otis. The authorities examined the letter and found that there were deliberate attempts to make the writing appear illiterate. Could the letter's author have been hiding their true educational background on purpose? As word of the letter spread, witnesses soon came forward with stories of a woman who resembled Julia's description. A young girl who resembled Mary Agnes and the woman were spotted together at a store. A witness saw the woman dictating a letter to a store employee. The Morones got a second letter from someone named Alice Henderson 2 weeks later. She claimed to be Julia Otis's cousin. Alice stated in her letter that Julia had lost both her husband and her child the year before, and so she had been craving love since her tragic loss. Alice expressed her wish for Julia to change her mind and give Mary Agnes back. She then ceased all correspondence with the family. Authorities eventually found that both letters had identical handwriting. For days after Mary Agnes was kidnapped on May 19th, Catherine Maroney took matters into her own hands and asked a judge for a warrant, accusing Julia Otis of abducting her first fruit. Both the public and law enforcement were puzzled by this mysterious woman's abduction of Mary Agnes Maroney. In an effort to find any indication of the two boarding a train, the police searched all of Chicago's railroad stations. However, it appeared as though the two had disappeared with no single trace. A girl fitting Mary Agnes' description was spotted in Rockford, Illinois. On July 23, 1931, a 3-year-old white girl who resembled Mary Agnes in terms of tan skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes was seen in a cart being pushed by an elderly Native American woman named Martha Thompson. When the Morones were notified and showed up to identify the girl, Martha claimed that the girl had been abandoned by her mother, whose name was Florence Fuller, and that she was on her way to join a circus with the child. The young girl, according to Catherine, was not Mary Agnes. Catherine gave the girl a thorough examination. She made sure she wasn't her daughter by inspecting her teeth and body. Both parents were inconsolable when it dawned on them that the girl wasn't Mary Agnes. One thing that set Mary Agnes apart from the girl from Rockford was the red mark on her arm. The case of Mary Agnes' disappearance eventually became cold because the investigation yielded no meaningful leads. In the coming years, the Maroney family welcomed another child whom they named Catherine into the world. They then had the good fortune to welcome 5 more boys named Michael Jr., Patrick, George, Harold, and William. When other kids went missing, the media frequently ran stories about Mary Agnes, keeping her name in the public eye. When Chicago Daily News reporter Eden Wright came across a picture of the Maroney family, he noticed something important. All of the family members looked alike, which gave him the idea for a story. In an effort to get someone to recognize Mary Agnes, the Chicago Daily News worked with the California newspaper to publish photos of the Maroney family. Soon enough, a Californian man by the name of Everett McClellan came forward in 1952. The men claimed that Anastasia, one of Mary Agnes' sisters, looked so much like his wife that it might have been her picture. The woman, Mary McClellan, was 24 years old and had been adopted in 1930 by Charles and Nora Beck. The teeth, blood type, skull type, fingerprints, and handprints of Mary McClellan appeared to be identical to those of Mary Agnes. However, Mary McClellan lacked 2 things Mary Agnes had. Mary Agnes was born a year later than McClellan, and McClellan did not have Mary Agnes' distinctive hernia scar from a surgical procedure. The newspaper arranged a meeting between Mary McClellan and Catherine on September 4, 1952, but much to everyone's dismay, Catherine Maroney insisted that Mary McClellan was not her lost daughter. Regardless, the women developed a close bond over time. Ultimately, a DNA test carried out in 2008 after Mary McClellan's demise established that she was not Mary Agnes. Mary Agnes' parents, Catherine and Michael, were profoundly affected by the tragic disappearance of their daughter. Michael passed away in 1957 at the age of 58, leaving behind an extraordinary amount of pain brought on by the loss of his dearly loved daughter. Depression plagued Catherine for years as she was consumed by the pain of her daughter's disappearance. She was only 49 years old when she died in 1962, after she had endured her loss all the way to the end. For close to a century, Mary Agnes' case remained a mystery. When Cook County Sheriff's Detective Jose Rodriguez started looking into Mary Agnes' disappearance in 2022 and contacted Terry Arnold, the daughter of a woman he thought was the long-lost Mary Agnes Maroney, the case took a great turn. Detective Rodriguez thought Mary Agnes might actually be Terry's mother based on DNA evidence. When the detective first explained his hypothesis that Jeanette Burchard might actually be Mary Agnes Maroney to Terry Arnold, Terry was doubtful and didn't buy it. She emphasized the absence of Mary Agnes' birthmark and other distinguishing features in her mother. But Terry agreed to take a commercial DNA test in order to disprove the theory and offer concrete proof. On October 28, 2022, the test results were received, and they produced a startling finding. Her genetic makeup, in contrast to Terry's Polish heritage, predominantly revealed Irish ancestry, which was a notable similarity with the Maroney family. The DNA test also established Terry Arnold's relationship to the Maroney family's surviving members as first-line cousins. This coincidental relationship strengthened the notion that Terry's mother was Mary Agnes Maroney. Who was she, though? Her family had been informed that Jeanette Burchard was born on April 14, 1928. She was raised by Jeanette Solrick Darris Anderson and her stepfather, Frank Darris. Detective Rodriguez did not find any obvious abnormalities in Burchard's family during his investigation. However, Terry provided a crucial piece of information. Frank Darris, Terry's step-grandfather, once told Jeanette Burchard that the woman who raised her wasn't her biological mother. Terry also claimed that her mother attempted to find out more about her true ancestry by contacting her Chicago-based cousins, but they claimed to be unaware of the situation. However, it was later discovered that before getting married to Frank Darris, the woman who raised Jeanette had a brief relationship with a man by the name of John Fahey. Fahey and the woman, along with Jeanette Burchard, were listed as residing in the same Chicago home in the 1930 census. After getting married to Darris, the family moved to Virginia in the early 1930s. Later, during World War II, they moved to Florida. Jeanette Burchard wed Edward Jennings in the 1940s, and the two of them had two children named Barbara Joan Jennings and Edward Clifton Jennings Jr. After starting her career as a nurse, Jeanette gave birth to Terry Arnold, her third child, in 1957. A few decades later, she wed Earl Burchard a second time. The Miami Dolphins were Jeanette's favorite team, and she supported them from the time they were founded in 1966 throughout her entire life. Jeanette was a nurse, but she also had a great love for animals, especially dogs and cats. She also loved opera, with Madame Butterfly being a particular favorite. According to Terry, the last time her mother visited Chicago was probably between 1989 and 1995, possibly for a funeral. She later died in Florida in 2003, and her remains were buried alongside her pets. A year later, her son, Edward Clifton Jennings Jr. died. Her daughter, Barbara Joan Jennings, soon passed away in 2006 too. Terry Arnold is, however, the only surviving child of Jeanette Burchard, and she is certain that Mary Agnes Maroney is indeed her mother, whom she knows as Jeanette Burchard. In an interview, Terry admitted that she didn't know anything about the name, Julia Otis, or how her grandmother ended up raising her mother, Jeanette Burchard. Terry is still oblivious to the circumstances surrounding this mystery. However, she acknowledged that Mary Agnes' parents never received closure or knew the truth about what really happened to their daughter and expressed sympathy and sadness for them. Terry assured the Maroney family that Jeanette Burchard, or Mary Agnes as Terry knew her, was dearly loved despite the unanswered questions. Mary Agnes Maroney was the subject of a decades-long, relentless search in 1930. The horrific chapter that has plagued the Maroney family's generations for almost a century has finally come to an end as of this year 2023. But there was still one unanswered question. Who was Julia Otis, and what motivated her to kidnap young Mary Agnes from her loving family? We will never be able to know some of these responses. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.